Okay, thank you. Yeah, as Vesna said, my name is Tom Beyers. I will take some time to show what we're doing at our research institute, PCG. It's part government funded, but we're mainly working for growers, for professional growers. So I'm always keeping that in mind, that it has to be commercially profitable, things like that. You don't have to. It's fine to think outside of the box. It's important to think outside of the box, but I'm just going to show you a little bit of what's already inside the box, so you can maybe use some valuable knowledge. Just to show you where we are located, this is a map of Belgium. Here's France, the Netherlands. This is where our research station is, near the city of Ghent. I want to paint a picture of the horticultural sector, or the greenhouse horticulture sector in Belgium and the Netherlands. In Belgium, we have about 2,000 hectares of greenhouses. About 50% is used for vegetable production, and the other 50% is used for ornamentals. The Netherlands are our bigger brother. They have about 10,000 hectares of greenhouses, and also 50-50 for vegetables and ornamentals. So there's a very big sector behind it. We've seen some evolutions during the past years, actually the past decades. There's the economy of scale that's coming into play. So there are fewer and fewer growers, but the area of greenhouses stays the same. So the growers that remain, they are building bigger and bigger greenhouses. For tomato greenhouses, the average to be profitable at the moment is at least 4 hectares for one company. The newer companies all start with at least 10 hectares and only on plots of land where they have the opportunity to expand to 20 hectares in the next couple of years, because the economy of scale is very hard at the moment. A lot of our production is already hydroponics. 99% of tomato production, 99% of pepper production, the same for cucumbers, 60% for leafy vegetable production, and herbs. It's also 100% or 99%, let's say, hydroponics, but it's just one company who's controlling the entire market. Why do we have so many greenhouses in the Netherlands and Belgium? It's actually a very good area for growing greenhouse vegetables. It's a very temperate climate, there's a lot of sunlight, and the rainfall is divided nicely over the entire year, so there's always enough water for irrigation. The temperate climate means that we can produce high quality produce. You could say, why are you not growing tomatoes in Spain in the summer? Well, it's just too warm to get good quality. If you go in a supermarket in Spain in the summer, you're likely to find Dutch or Belgian tomatoes. So that's a little bit the picture that's going on at the moment. There's new legislation for IPM, integrated pest management, so growers cannot just use pesticides anymore. They have to look first at biological alternatives, and then if they have to use pesticides, they have to use selective pesticides. They have to do monitoring of the pests, of beneficial insects, so they can show why they have treated with chemical pesticides. It's not that these conventional growers, they are they want to hurt the environment or anything, because I often get the claim, aquaponics is so much better than conventional hydroponics because we're not using chemicals because the fish would die. Also in the conventional culture, especially of fruity vegetables like pepper, tomato and cucumber, the use of pesticides is almost non-existent, and only in like real emergency situations they will use them. If you have any questions in the meantime, just please ask me. I sometimes forget critical steps in the explanation process because they are so used to me. but it might not be clear to you, so please, if something is unclear, just interrupt me. This is a picture of our research institute. I'm responsible for the greenhouses, so we have 5,000 square meters of greenhouse at our research institute, and also 6 hectares of open field vegetables. We also have a sensory analysis lab, so a lot of the work that we do is on looking at the effects of, for instance, fertilization or variety selection on the taste of vegetables. But we also did some work in the past on fish to see what's the effect of aquaponics, for instance, on flavor. Then on the hydroponics part, we have also for the open air vegetables hydroponic systems. You don't have to be looking at greenhouses if you want to do hydroponics production. We have the NFT gullies that are just normal flat NFT systems, but we also have the slope systems for experiments. Inside the greenhouses, we have 2 main parts. We have the hydroponic part, which is the conventional part, but we also have an organically certified part. Within this organic research, we also do a lot of collaborations with CSAs, not myself, those are my colleagues, but are people from CSAs who want to collaborate or want information, just contact me. Vesna has my email address. If you have some questions about organic production, you can always ask me, we have lots of experience with it. And then some pictures from our hydroponic greenhouse. We have a mobile gully system, which is basically an NFT system where the gullies start in the beginning close to next to each other when the plants are small. You see here, the gullies are next to each other. When the plants grow, the gullies move to the front of the system, and in 5 stages the gullies are moved further apart to allow the plants to grow. In this way, we get optimal use of the surface area of the greenhouse. We can produce 3 times as much heads of lettuce or herbs in a system like this when compared to just soil culture. There are 9 growers already with a system like this in Belgium, and they are supplying about 50% of the market. The other 50% is produced by growers that are growing in the soil, and there are about 200 of them. So there's also economy of scale in these hydroponic systems. Here you see a picture of the end phase of the system. This is a red lettuce type, but here you see that the gullies are spaced much farther apart so to allow some room for the plants. A picture of a hydroponics tomato greenhouse that we have for experiments, a small greenhouse. And in our bigger hydroponics greenhouse for leafy vegetables, we have our aquaponics system. So you have the gullies where normally the plants would be standing in, and underneath we have fish tanks. 2 fish tanks of 7.5 cubic meters each that we use for experiments.
Tom,
yeah.
The one you mentioned, the herb production, right? So how many different varieties of herbs are they producing? These producers, 1, 2, 3 in one greenhouse. I mean,
basil, coriander, chives, parsley.
Okay, so not only one, just it's a mixture of herbs in one greenhouse. Okay.
Yeah. So in our aquaponics system, actually we've never used it for growing leafy vegetables yet, because we are too afraid of the sodium in the water for leafy vegetables. We use it for growing tomatoes. We have experience with rock wool. That's the conventional substrate that's used normally for tomato production. But also with organic substrates, we did a lot of trials with hemp substrates, cocoa fiber, peat. So if you have any questions about those, please ask. And that means that the organic load is not that much. But if you see in other trials where we use organic fertilizers on such type of substrates, there you don't get clogging of the organic fertilizers themselves, but there's a lot of carbon in those organic fertilizers, and it will stimulate growth of microorganisms in the substrates. and those substrates, they are supposed to be stable. Stable. They are not supposed to be broken down by microorganisms. They contain a lot of lignin, and that's supposed to be inert. But if you keep on watering them with very high concentrations of organic fertilizers, you see that you do get breakdown of these lignin-rich compounds, and then everything starts to clog because you lose the cell structure of your substrate. That's definitely a problem when you're using organic substrates. One of the advantages that you have, of course, is that you can throw out your substrate or compost it in the case of an organic substrate, start with a new one, and you have a disease-free medium.
How long can you use organic substrate?
We use this for one crop, and for peppers, eggplants, and tomatoes, that means 12 months. For cucumbers, it means about 5 months. And then it's thrown out. For the organic substrate, it's being composted. Now the newer substrate mats, they have compostable plastics on them, biodegradable plastics, so that's no problem. For the rock wool, what happens to it is the plastic is discarded, and the rock wool itself, it's milled, and the product is used in making bricks. So it's not complete waste, it's recycled, but not anymore as a substrate for growing plants. Normally, our omega perch, it's an Australian fish. You can compare it a lot with tilapia in the way that it grows, that it feeds. It's also an omnivorous fish, but it can be grown completely on vegetarian feed, so you don't need fish meal. One of the big advantages is that there's no production of this type of fish.
Say again, what's the name of it?
Omega perch.
Alright.
Yeah. It's actually, Omega perch is a brand name. It's a trademark. It's the trademark of our neighbor, who has a Omega perch farm and is also developing hatchery activities. So in the near future, fingerlings of this Omega perch will be commercially available.
The temperature is the same as tilapia, or is it?
It's about the same, yeah. Optimally 28 degrees. We grow them at 26 because it's economically a little bit more interesting. Definitely the temperature has to be above 22 degrees. Otherwise, they start to get problems with diseases and things like that. They get more susceptible to all kinds of diseases. At the moment, we have about 350 kilograms of tilapia in our systems because we couldn't get enough omega perch to produce all the fishes and waste that we needed.
Can you write the name of the perch? I don't understand the name. Omega, or...
Yeah.
That's the brand name, it's not...
It's a brand.
Even it's a
Some
brand...
species is the brand name, so it's different. It's not the name of the species, but it's the brand name.
Omega. Oh.
Yeah.
So, white
Omega, because they probably get free.
Yeah.
Omega perch.
Yeah, it is a fish species that contains a lot of omega-3 fatty acids. And the difference between, for instance, omega perch and salmon is that salmon gets his omega-3 fatty acids from the feed that it gets, while the omega perch, it can produce the fatty acids itself. This is a picture of the company that we do the most of our aquaponics work for. That's our neighbor. There are two companies actually, Tomato Masters. They have a 10.6 hectare tomato greenhouse, and next to it there's the Omega perch fish farm where they produce 200 tons of Omega perch each year. Here in the back you can see our research greenhouse, and here at the end of this road I live. That's my house. But this is just to give you a picture of the scale of the installations that we are looking for at building. It's not backyard aquaponics, and that's the box that I'm in. for me it's hard to think outside of that box. The outline of the presentation will be about the basic biochemistry of plant growth first, just to explain you some basic processes. Probably you all know them already, but it's just a good recapitulation to see what are the laws of physics or the laws of biology that you can't do without in hydroponics or aquaponics. And then later on we'll discuss the factors that influence plant growth in greenhouses or in aquaponic systems. So, the water, temperature, nutrients, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and then a few words on light, the importance of genetics and breeding, and pests and diseases. Now, the main focus is on these first three, but if you have any other questions on the other topics. The basic biochemistry of plant growth. What is driving plant growth are two main processes. The first one is photosynthesis. That's what plants use to combine carbon dioxide and water with the energy of sunlight into sugars and oxygen. Now, that sugars they use in the second process called respiration, that's also what occurs in animals, to break down the sugars with the use of oxygen into energy that they can use for growth, carbon dioxide and water. In those processes, photosynthesis is going on during the daytime, of course, because you need solar energy for that. Respiration is going on all the time, during the daytime and during the night. Respiration also occurs in the roots, as I've written down here. So they consume large amounts of oxygen, and you shouldn't forget that. It will be repeated throughout the presentation. Make sure that the roots are aerated very well.
Tom?
Yeah?
Do you have an indication on how much oxygen the roots use? Like a rule of thumb?
I don't know it by heart. I should look it up. But it's quite a lot. For instance, in the DFT systems, like the floating systems with the rafts, if you don't supply extra oxygen in the water, you will get slowing down of the growth, definitely. We've seen it with lots of growers who have been experimenting with it, and or even plants start to die. And then when they start experimenting themselves with placing aerators in the water, you see right on top of the aerator, you have a plant this big, and next to it, or 5 meters next to it, you have a plant this big. It says enough, of course.
But normally aeration, just aeration with air is enough to supply all those.
Yeah. But it all depends, of course, in what type of system you're working. If it's a NFT, if it's a floating system, if you're working with substrates. For the photosynthesis, of course, you need chlorophyll for photosynthesis. That's what the plant uses for harvesting the solar energy. This is a close-up of some plant cells with the chlorophyll in it. This is the chemical or the molecular structure of chlorophyll. Doesn't really matter, you don't have to know it by heart. But what's important is that, of course, it contains a lot of carbon, like all organic compounds. But there's also several nitrogen atoms in it, and also a magnesium atom. And that will come back when we talk about nutrients. You need chlorophyll, so you also need definitely nitrogen and magnesium, otherwise you cannot harvest the solar energy. Now, during photosynthesis, plants need to get this carbon dioxide from the air. How do they do it? They have special equipment for gas exchange, and those are the stomata. And the stomata, they are openings in the leaf surface, mostly on the underside of the leaf. and they can open and close. The plants use it for getting carbon dioxide from the outside air and getting rid of the oxygen that they produce during photosynthesis, and also getting rid of water vapor. The stomata, they close during the night because then they are not doing photosynthesis, so they don't want to lose extra water. But they also close when the plants are under stress. And what does stress mean for a plant? It's too cold, too hot, too low relative humidity, there's too much salt at their roots. Those are all stress factors. And then the stomata close because the plant doesn't want to lose extra water. But it also means that if the stomata close because they're stressed, you cannot have photosynthesis and you will lose productivity. Respiration is still going on because there's temperature and there's energy needed to keep the plant alive. So you're basically breaking down the sugars of the plants. If you want to produce tomatoes, you want to produce tasty tomatoes, you want as much sugars as possible in your fruits. So you don't want the plants to have stress, of course, because then you will have bland fruit. And that's one of the main themes in this presentation, how to avoid plant stress to get as much photosynthesis as possible. So again, the take-home message, if your plants are stressed, you will not get photosynthesis. Another process that will be important in hydroponics is the uptake of water by the root. Now, how do roots take up water? There's outside, this is a close-up of a root, like a section. Outside of the root, there's water with a concentration of nutrients in it. And that water with the nutrients diffuses through the cells. Inside the root, there's a semi-permeable layer. So water can get through, but nutrients cannot get through that layer. Here inside, there's a much higher concentration of nutrients by the plant because there's active uptake of nutrients in through another system. Here there's a high osmotic pressure. So here you have lots of nutrients. Here you have less nutrients. Through osmosis, water will go through this semi-permeable layer and get into the roots. That's the way that plants take up water. Why is this important? If you have more nutrients here, it will be harder for the plant to take up the water. That's to keep something to keep in mind, of course. And a good measure for the amount of nutrients that's here, or how hard it is for the plant to take up water, is the electrical conductivity, EC. It's something that will be repeated throughout the presentation also. Short word about DNA, RNA and proteins. I'm not talking about genetically modified organisms, but in every living cell there is DNA, there is gene transcription and the production of proteins. How does it work? It's not that important for this presentation. It will be mostly what's in the next slide. But you have in your DNA strands, which are in every cell, there are genes. Depending on the situation that the plant is in, it will transcribe different genes. It's turned into RNA, and from that RNA it can be translated into proteins. Now, what are proteins? Proteins are really the working horses of cells. They can have structural functions. They can have, for instance, functions in defense against diseases. But a lot of them, they are like machines. They can convert certain chemicals into other chemical compounds. So those are really, really needed to get a cell to function properly. How does this DNA look? It's a double strand, not that important. What is important for this presentation is that it has a phosphodiester backbone, and there's a lot of phosphate in that. if you want to grow plants, you cannot do that without phosphor. You need to have it from fertilizers. In the proteins, they are built up from amino acids. This is a general structure of an amino acid. This R means, well, that's a variable part of the amino acid, but there's always nitrogen in an amino acid. So you need this nitrogen to get cells to function properly. Carbon can be assimilated through photosynthesis from carbon dioxide that the plants take from the air. But all the other atoms that I've been talking about, and there are a lot more, they need to be taken up by the roots. Or you can also use foliar feeding. That's more complex in theory. But all these things have to be taken up by the root. And that's something you shouldn't forget. And there can actually be no discussion about aquaponics or fish feed supplies everything that plants need. It's either in there and plants can take it up, or it's not in there and then you will have deficiencies. The first part, a little bit of showing the framework, what it's about, what's going on inside the plants. Now the second part will be about the factors that influence plant growth. Are there any questions about the first part already?
Tom, will you say something about the contents of the nutrients you should have outside the roots, so within the system? Is there a threshold?
I will show it a little bit later in the presentation.
All right.
The thing is that I didn't show real figures in the presentation because it's impossible to say it for plants in general.
Right.
It's different for every species, and it's even different for every variety.
Mm-hmm.
There can be quite big differences between
But
tomato varieties.
rough rules of thumb or something?
For a rule of thumb, I would say that a general electrical conductivity, general EC of 2.2 millisiemens per centimeter would be a good thing to grow at. For nitrate, say you aim at 10 or 11 millimole per liter of nitrate, which should be about 300 milligrams per liter nitrate. That would be, for a general plant, a good nitrate level in a hydroponic solution.
300 milligram
Yeah.
per liter.
Yeah, but that's for instance for leafy vegetables. For strawberries, it will be a little bit lower because they are very sensitive to high EC values.
You think it's maybe it's 30 milligrams?
No.
300.
300, yeah.
I mean the optimum.
Sounds like
That's the optimum
a huge amount.
Yeah, sure. That's the optimum concentration.
All right.
There's a little bit of luxury uptake.
So I'm not afraid to have too much nutrients in my systems.
Well, for your fish, it will become a problem, of course. So where does heat or temperature come into play? You have this rate of photosynthesis at different temperatures. Well, there are no numbers on this graph because it's just a general picture. It's different for every plant species, but this is how it generally looks. At low temperatures, you have a low rate of photosynthesis, and it rises with the temperature. There's an optimum point, and when it gets too hot, efficiency of photosynthesis goes down. This is photosynthesis alone. If you look at the respiration process, it also increases with temperature. But there's no real optimum, it just keeps on increasing. So you need to find for your plant species the optimal temperature where the difference between the amount of photosynthesis that's going on and the amount of energy that's used for respiration to keep the plant alive is the biggest, because this difference is the amount of energy, the amount of carbon that the plant can invest in growth. Which means that it's important, of course, to control the temperature in the greenhouse. Yeah, again, the take-home message: proper temperature management is needed to obtain net growth. But not only to obtain net growth, it's also important to get a good morphology of your plants. For instance, tomato plants, they need a diurnal rhythm of temperature. It means that the temperature during the day should be higher than the temperature during the night. If you don't get this, then you don't get a generative stimulus, which means that you will get low quality of flowers, and especially low quality of pollen. And then the flowers will not be pollinated, you don't get good fruits. For instance, with leafy vegetables, if the temperature is too high, and especially the balance between the temperature and the amount of light that's coming in, you will get bolting of your leafy vegetables. This is a picture of a lettuce plant. Normally, of course, it should form a head, but here the temperature was too high and you get bolting. Of course, you cannot sell a product like this anymore. You could try to eat it, but the problem is that the leaves get very bitter when they start bolting. A little bit of a complicated graph when we're talking about water. But why is water important for plants? It's one part of the photosynthesis, of course, but the main function of transpiration by the leaves is for evaporative cooling. So the temperature of the leaf, or the leaf has to be cooled because there's radiation coming into the leaf. It would otherwise get too hot and the cells would be damaged. To cool down this leaf, the plant starts to evaporate water. It's like if you're coming out of a shower. Outside the shower, it might be 20 or 25 degrees, but because there's a layer of moisture on your skin that's evaporating, it's extracting heat from your skin, and that's why it feels cold or a little bit fresh. That's also what's occurring in plants. And the amount of water that plants can evaporate, it depends on the relative humidity inside the greenhouse. Now, in this graph, the green lines indicate the relative humidity. And you see that for a different temperature, the air can contain more. If the temperature increases, the air can contain more water. So, for instance, if at 20 degrees there's 10 grams per cubic meter per kilograms, 10 grams of water per kilogram of air. At 20 degrees, you are about at 70% relative humidity. At 30 degrees, you're only at about 35% relative humidity, which means that if you're in a greenhouse and you're controlling relative humidity, if you keep it constantly at, let's say, 70%, plants will have to work much harder at 30 degrees with evaporating than at 20 degrees. And that can cause stress. So also management of relative humidity is very important in a greenhouse. Here these lines, these blue lines, also indicate the amount of energy that the air contains at a certain level of relative humidity, or a certain amount of water vapor in the air. And you see that the more water vapor the air contains, the higher the energy content is. That's because water vapor contains a lot of latent heat. And the consequence is that if you want to get rid of the humidity inside your greenhouse, you will lose energy. So it's an energy-intensive process getting rid of the humidity inside the greenhouse. So an important thing to keep in mind is that your plants will be evaporating water depending on the greenhouse climate. So depending on the temperature and depending on the relative humidity. But that's whether they are growing efficiently or not. If they don't have nutrients or not enough nutrients, they will not actually grow, but they will evaporate a lot of water. And that affects your water use efficiency, of course. You could say that in an aquaponic system, your water use efficiency is very high because you're using it first to grow fish and then to grow plants. But if you don't have a good nutrient balance in your water, then you will actually use more water than you would use for normal hydroponics production. And also, if you have water evaporation but no proper nutrient uptake, you will get a lot of humidity inside your greenhouse. You have to get rid of that, and that's an energy-intensive process because that humidity contains a lot of latent heat. A little word about why this evaporation or transpiration of water is important. So I already talked about the water uptake by the roots. Nutrient uptake is an active process. Plants really have to spend energy to take up some of the nutrients from the soil. Those nutrients are collected by the roots. They come into the vascular tissue of the plants. Vascular tissue, they are basically tubes running all the way from the roots of the plants to the leaves in the stem. And this is a picture of it. And those tubes are filled with water. If you get transpiration in the leaves, you lose water in the leaves, and there will be a flow of water going through these tubes. And this is what takes the nutrients from the roots to the leaves where they are needed for making new plant material. Now, these tubes that you see here, the size and the amount of those tubes is dependent on the conditions that the plant is growing in. If you have a plant growing in very high relative humidity, it cannot evaporate a lot of water, so it does not need very wide vascular tissue. You will have very fine tubes. The other way around, if you grow a plant at very low relative humidity, it has to evaporate a lot of water, it will grow very wide tubes. And in this way, you train a plant for certain conditions. That doesn't have to be a real problem, but what it does mean is that if the conditions change rapidly, then this vascular tissue is not designed or not built to do the job. And then you get, you can have problems with, for instance, tip burn. Tip burn. Here, this is when plants cannot, the roots cannot follow with supplying water to the leaves because the vascular tissue was not designed for it. The other picture is glaziness, and that's an effect from root pressure. So you have this evaporative driving force for taking the nutrients from the roots to the leaves. But also there's a lot of nutrients in the roots then. There's a lot of osmotic pressure building up. If the leaves decide to stop transpiring because temperature drops or because it becomes very humid at some moment, then you will have still a lot of pressure going on in the roots, and it might force the water from the roots into the leaves, but there it cannot be transpired, and cells may be broken just by the water pressure, and that also results in quality loss, of course. Something to keep in mind in your aquaponic systems, to keep these conditions as stable as possible. Another condition that affects this physiological disorder in leafy vegetables is a difference between root temperature and leaf temperature. If your water in your floating system is quite warm, but the air above it is quite low, then the roots will be very active. They will send up a lot of water, but the leaves, they are not active, they will not be transpiring, and then you get these disorders. The black patches in basil, it's usually because of potassium deficiency. And one of the main things that potassium is needed for in plant cells is to keep up turgor pressure, it's called, to keep the water pressure inside the cell to keep its form, and also to close the stomata, because actually on both sides of the stomata there's a guard cell. We'll go back to the picture. These guard cells, if the stomata need to close, or a stomach needs to close, there's potassium pumped into these guard cells. Also water will follow, because then turgor pressure will rise, and it's actually pressed close. If you don't have enough potassium, then those stomates cannot close when there's a lot of solar radiation, and the leaf will dry out, and that will give the black spot in basil. Now, tea burn can also have a different cause, not just too much evaporation, but also too little evaporation can give tea burn, and that's because the driving force for calcium uptake is the transpiration stream. Like nitrogen can be quite actively transported from older leaves to younger leaves when it's needed. Calcium, for calcium that cannot be done. You need transpiration to get calcium to the leaves. For instance, in a head of lettuce, you have the inside leaves, and there usually you don't have much transpiration because there's no air movement. The leaves are very close together, so there's a big risk of running out of calcium. Why is calcium needed? Calcium is built into the cell walls of plants, and you can think of a cell wall of a plant like an egg box structure, and it's quite unstable unless you place in the calciums in the places where the egg is supposed to be, and that will link the entire egg box structure, so you get a strong cell wall. If you don't have the calcium in there, you'll have weak cell walls, and if you have changes in water content, the cells will just collapse, and you get these brown tips of the leaves. Of course, if you're just going to eat the lettuce yourself, it's no problem, you just cut it off. There's nothing wrong with the head of lettuce, but if you want to sell it, if you only have a very small tip like that, you can just throw it out. It's impossible to sell it. How can you... Okay. Why calcium is important? So the calcium makes strong cell walls. So it's needed to prevent the collapse of the cells when there are changes in water pressure inside the plant. Now, calcium doesn't get into these parts of the leaves because the leaves, they are inside the head of lettuce, and there's no, there's a high humidity, there's a microclimate because you don't have a lot of air movement there. It's just because of the structure of the head of lettuce. And calcium is only supplied through the water flow of transpiration. Normally, you can avoid it by creating a little bit of root pressure during the night. So when it becomes night, you keep the water temperature of your floating system a little bit higher than the outside air temperature, and especially if you use overhead irrigation to make the heads of lettuce wet, create a high relative humidity in the greenhouse, the roots will start pumping up a little bit of water inside the leaves, also the inner leaves, and that will bring up the calcium to where it's needed the most at that time. It's very hard to control that. Even professional growers have problems with that on a regular basis. And it doesn't matter how much calcium you supply in the nutrient solution. Of course, it has to be present, but if you don't have this transpiration flow, it will not get into the parts of the plants where it's needed. You also have the same problem, for instance, with the fruits of a plant, like a tomato plant, because fruits, they are not transpiring a lot of water. They don't have stomates like leaves have. So there's very few calcium coming into fruits. If there are problems with water uptake in tomato plants, they will extract water from the fruits to supply their vital parts. When you then irrigate the tomato plants, so they do have enough water, they start pumping it back into the fruit, and then the fruits they burst, or you get also how is it called in English? Well, I'll show you a picture in a minute of how it works. I don't know the English word. Some other problems that can be associated with humidity of the air, then high humidity, it's decreased nutrient transport, because you need this evaporative flow or of the transpiration flow. If there's very high relative humidity in the greenhouse, plants will not be able to transpire water, and there can be no transport of nutrients from the roots to the leaves. So it's very important to get rid of this high relative humidity in the greenhouse, although it might cost energy. A high relative humidity also gives problems with diseases. A lot of fungi like to grow in conditions of high humidity, and I think the next slide is a picture of a very common disease that occurs in leafy vegetables that are grown under high relative humidity. It's downy mildew. First, it's shown as yellow spots on the leaves. Usually they are quite angular spots because it's between several veins of a leaf. So that's how you can recognize it. So really angular spots enclosed by the veins of the leaves. And on the other side of the leaf, you will get white sporulation forming. You can imagine that consumers or your clients, they don't want to see this on the leafy vegetables that you sell. That's a good reason to keep the relative humidity in the greenhouse under control. Other problems with diseases, for instance on tomato, it's grey mold growing on the tomatoes. Usually the defense system of an unripe tomato, is strong enough to keep fungal infections at bay. That's what you see here. Here, all the white spots on the tomato fruits, I don't know if you can see it in the back of the room, but those are places that the tomato fruit has been reinforcing its cell walls to keep the fungus out. So the fungus cannot infect, but of course a tomato with all white spots on it, that's also something that consumers would not like to eat. The thing about pollination, if the relative humidity in a greenhouse, if you're growing eggplants or tomatoes, if the relative humidity is too high, the pollen will start making clumps. It will not be a powder that the bumblebees can take up, but it will start making clumps, and then you won't get good pollination. All things to keep in mind. And then the last thing I put on there is leaf quality. it depends on what your customer wants. But if you grow a plant at high relative humidity, it cannot evaporate a lot of water. So it will start forming broader leaves, bigger leaves, thinner leaves to increase its surface from which it can evaporate water. If you grow it at a low relative humidity, it will form thicker leaves, smaller leaves. So yeah, it depends on how you want your lettuce to look like, but you can control it a little bit with relative humidity. Some Fusarium strains, they produce very, very potent mycotoxins, very carcinogenic. And there are also other pathogens, for instance of wheat, that can cause psychological damage. And, I had some words about dehumidification, so how to get rid of the humidity inside the greenhouse. Usually high relative humidity is a bigger problem than a low relative humidity. If you have a low relative humidity, depending of course on the outside climate, if you're here in summer in Slovenia and it's 35 degrees outside, then low relative humidity might be a problem. But in temperate climates, usually the plants just keep on transpiring and the humidity in the greenhouse will build up. The simplest way to get rid of it is of course opening the vents. So opening the windows on top of the greenhouse. If it's summer and outside temperatures are quite high and the air outside is quite dry, then it's easy. You just open the vents, you get rid of the moisture inside the greenhouse. Of course, when it's a little bit colder or when it's raining outside, or it has been raining outside, the relative humidity outside is also almost 100%. So what do you need to do then? You need to increase the temperature in the greenhouse, because as I showed you in the previous graph, warmer air can contain more water than colder air. So what you do is you heat up the air in the greenhouse a little bit, you open the vents, the hot air escapes with the moisture, and you take in colder air from outside. That colder air is also almost 100% relative humidity, but once it's in the greenhouse, you start heating it up, and then it falls down to about 60% relative humidity. So it can contain more water, and that's how you get rid of the water from the moisture inside the greenhouse. Now, of course, you're heating the greenhouse with the vents open, so that's quite expensive, and that's what I was trying to tell you about the energy-intensive process of getting rid of that moisture, of moisture control in the greenhouse. There are also newer technologies that can do that. With using a heat pump, you create a cold, and you use that cold water flow to drive a heat exchanger where the moisture from the air condenses on, and then in that way you can extract moisture from your greenhouse in an active way without opening the vents. Those are things that are coming into practice in greenhouses these days in the newer projects. And then one of the last things about water uptake. Water uptake requires healthy roots. Your roots can be in the water, for instance, in a floating system, but if the roots are not healthy, they cannot take up water. And roots, again, they need oxygen to survive. Here you see a picture of plant roots that were in water with low oxygen levels, and you see they start rotting. Usually you get fungal infections on it. Pythium is one of the pathogens that can easily infect such roots. So it's one thing to keep in mind. It's not just enough to place the roots in water. You have to keep them healthy and supply them with enough oxygen. Now, a way to supply them with enough oxygen is to choose a properly designed substrate. So these substrates, I already showed you a picture from them earlier. They contain large cells and smaller cells. Well, a cell is a cavity, a hole. The larger cells, they will keep containing air. The smaller cells, they will fill with water through capillarity. And you need the right mix of large cavities and small cavities to get a good oxygen supply to your roots. And also something that we already talked about, you asked the question of what happens when you get a lot of organic material in the substrate. What's going on? Doesn't it give problems with clogging? Yes, it does. This is a picture of a trial that we're running at the moment where we supply a lot of organic fertilizers to a substrate. The substrate is being degraded by microorganisms, and then you get problems with oxygen supply, your roots die, and eventually your plant follows, it also dies. Different examples of substrates. So you already saw cocoa fiber and rock wool. Here in these boxes there's perlite. Perlite is a volcanic material. It's used a lot for cucumber growing. Why do they use it for cucumber growing? One of the advantages of perlite is that you can make it really dry and then make it really wet again. While in cocoa peat, or especially in rock wool, that's very hard. Once those materials become dry, it's very hard to get them properly wet again. So those are all things to keep in mind. For strawberry production, just peat mixture is used. It's the potting soil that you know from your plants in the living room, for instance. That's also a perfectly good substrate, depending on your application. For substrate culture, usually drippers are used to supply the nutrient solution. One of the things that you have to keep in mind when you're doing aquaponics is to get rid of all the suspended particles in the water, because here inside the dripper there's a labyrinth of capillary canals, and it gets clogged really easily. Of course, usually not all those drippers get clogged at the same time. You have a couple of plants that don't receive water and they die, which can cause big losses. Some more pictures of our mobile gully system. So this is NFT. What happens here is we don't have these drippers, but the plants are standing on a peat block in a gully where a few milliliters of nutrient solution is running through. Not all the time, like running through is maybe not the correct English term, but the gullies are like sloped, inclined, only 1 or 2%. And we just feed him a little stream of nutrient solution at one side, and it makes a stream of a couple of millimeters of nutrient solution that runs to the other side. Not continuously, it's all controlled by our climate computer in the greenhouse, depending on how much solar radiation that's happening, depending on what the temperature in the greenhouse is. Because if you supply too much nutrient solution, the peat blocks will become too wet and the roots inside will die. You also need a good balance between oxygen and water uptake, of course.
You can compare with NFT system? Or?
This is an NFT system.
This is an NFT.
Yeah. But if you want plants to grow properly in an NFT system, you cannot run it all the time, like a continuous flow of water, or you should make sure that before you plant the plants in that NFT system, the roots are already coming out of the pots quite well. And then it's possible to run an NFT system continuously actually.
In our NFT system, we have a continuously flow of water. And
Yeah.
Well, I don't understand what is the disadvantage of to have a continuously.
Yeah.
Oxygenation for the roots.
Yeah, the oxygenation of the roots.
You need to have the roots outside the.
Outside the water,
Because
one
No,
moment.
outside the block or the pot.
I understand, yeah.
like this is the P block. Here you have your plant growing on there. You have this very shallow layer of water running through there. And this water is very well oxygenated because it's a thin layer. There's a large contact area between the surface air. And when your roots are here in that layer, then it's no problem. But the roots that are primarily formed when the plant is young inside this peat block, yeah, if this peat block is continuously in the water, it will soak up a lot of water until it's completely saturated. And inside here, there's a lot of there's very few oxygen, so your roots will start dying. Actually, I misphrased it when I said it's impossible. Economically, it's impossible because if you place a plant in a continuously running NFT system, you will lose about 2 or 3 days of growth speed. So it's not impossible, but it's just impossible to make money of it. As if compared to a hydroponics grower that doesn't do this. So yeah, it is possible to grow the plants, but you lose a little bit of growth speed. Picture of a floating system. I suppose all of you know it, but there you have this. Instead of a very shallow layer of water, you have a very deep layer of water. One of the advantages of a system like this is that you have a much bigger water buffer, of course. If here your pump breaks down of electricity, you have a electricity blackout, plants have a big buffer. They are able to take up water from the reservoir, while here in an NFT system, if your pump breaks down, the roots, they have no water and your plant will die quickly. You will not see it immediately on your plant, but when the roots become dry, the tips will die almost instantly, and after a couple of hours you see the effects.
And you call it DFT?
It's for deep flow technique instead of NFT, which stands for nutrient film technique.
It's raft sort of.
Yeah, this is a raft system. Yeah, it's just a terminology that.
Okay, raft.
Another thing that's not that common yet, there are a couple of reasons why it's not that common. It's just a picture from our research institute. It's an hydroponic system where you're not having this nutrient solution or the roots continuously in the nutrient solution, but you spray the nutrient solution on the roots, which ensures the best aeration actually of your root system. But it's technically more complicated, and I'm not really sure if the advantages are big enough to have this technical complexity.
Might be good for a starship.
Yeah, for a starship, for instance. But for the greenhouse, for what we've seen in our testing facilities, the growing speed on a hydroponics setup is not that much faster than on a general hydroponic setup, NFT or DFT.